let's just remind ourselves a little bit of what we mean by object-oriented programming. You may commonly see it abbreviated to OOP. And we'll look at how, today we're going to look at how we do these things in Python. So let's imagine that we want to write some code that defines how an ambulance works. Remember, this is the example that we used in the Principles of Programming session. And we said that in an object-oriented programming world, we would think about an ambulance as being an object that has properties that the ambulance has, and there will be things that the ambulance does. Okay, so the properties it has might be things like, you know, the trust it belongs to, the registration number of the vehicle, whether there's currently a patient on board or not, whether the siren's currently going off or not, pieces of information about that particular ambulance. But there will also be things that it does. An ambulance can drive, it can park, it can have patients loaded into and out of it. Its siren can be switched on and off. And in object-oriented programming, we refer to the properties that it has as attributes and the things that it does as methods. And methods, remember, are just another name for functions. They are just functions, but we tend to call them methods when they're part of an object. But you'll hear method and function used interchangeably. It's basically the same thing. So in object-oriented programming, we have this concept of a class, and basically a class is kind of like a blueprint for what this object is and does. So the properties it has and the methods that it can carry out, so the things it does. From that class, from that blueprint, we then create various instances of objects that refer to particular ambulances, and that process is known as instantiation. And so we can create from an ambulance class, we could create lots of individual ambulances. Like I could have my own ambulance, Sammy could have an ambulance, Amy could have an ambulance, and all of those ambulances would be instances of the ambulance class, and we refer to them as objects. These are objects, okay, and they've all been created from this blueprint, and we can work with them all independently and separately from each other. In our example, we have a class called ambulance, which has various attributes and various methods, and the attributes are basically variable assignments, and the methods are basically functions. But crucially, the variable assignments and functions belong to that object and belong to that class. So this might be our blueprint for our class. We've got these attributes: the name of the trust, the registration number, whether the patient's on board, which might be a Boolean value, true or false, to say whether they are. Same with the whether the siren's on, and then methods like to drive, and we pass in a certain speed for them to drive, and if we want them to park, the location where we want them to park, etc., etc. So that's the class, that's the blueprint, and these would be specific instances of that blueprint, of that class. These are our objects. Okay, so we create a class which defines what an ambulance is and does, and then when we want to use that, we create instances of that class, and we work with them as objects. So here I've created two instances of the ambulance class. I've got Dan's ambulance and Sammy's ambulance, and Dan's ambulance has a name of a trust, Chalk NHS Trust, and this registration number doesn't have a patient on board, but the siren's going off. And in Sammy's ambulance, Sammy's got a different name of a trust because it's a different object, it's completely separate. So she can have her own trust name, her own registration number. In this case, there is a patient on board and her siren is going off like mine. We also talked in Principles of Programming about the concept of a constructor. And a constructor is basically something that defines what happens when we go through this process of instantiation. So when we create an object from a class from the blueprint. And what the constructor does is it basically puts one of these objects together, it assembles it, okay, and it will do things like it'll specify the values that it should have, the attribute values that it should have at the start when it's first created at its inception. Sometimes it might even run some particular methods when it's first created, when that object is first born, if you like. And the constructor is in itself a method that lives within the class. And you'll see how that works in Python in a moment. So in our example, we might have our constructor that would set up the name of the trust for our ambulance and the registration number. And it might specify that any ambulance that we create by default, at the start, the siren will be off and there will be no patient loaded in.